Thanks, Joe, and greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So when we look at policy management, typically there are challenges that you're facing as you look to implement or grow or mature your policy management program. And typically those controls have to do with, or those challenges have to do with processes that are broken or not as streamlined as you like, or your need to interact with your user community or your employees in a more advanced way. So when we look at policy management challenges, typically we've seen that they fall into a couple buckets, and that's what you see on the slide before you. Typically, we'll find that customers have trouble with the fact that policies and controls are siloed. They're not in a centralized location. They tend to be out of date or not very well updated and typically very unstructured for the needs of companies today. As a result of being unstructured from a policy standpoint, your processes tend to be unstructured as well, and there tends to be some trouble documenting the procedures and processes around actually implementing some of your policy. Very often, a user community or group will have trouble understanding what are their guidelines and what governs the business and how they do their job from day to day to maintain policy adherence. As you look more toward the communication aspect, typically there seems to be a challenge around how you communicate your policy. How do you raise awareness around how that policy applies, who it applies to, and what the changes may be? And then finally, what are the exceptions to the rules, and how do I manage those particular exceptions? And as you look to mature your policy management solution and policy management program, typically you'll find that the solutions come from really aligning those particular policies, normalizing those policies and standards into a common language that can be related to each other and then related to the user community in question. Mapping those policies to the control standards and objectives and the authoritative sources that you're bound by on a regular basis, and providing a mechanism to regularly update and notify the appropriate individuals. Centralize that environment, so no longer do you have silos everywhere. You have one place where you can go. You have a consistent view, consistent environment for the standards, how you implement the procedures, and how you gain feedback about them. Notifying the right users at the right time, making sure that your training programs and awareness programs are followed and that the users get the right information presented to them. And then finally, with the exceptions, how do I manage those exceptions, relate them back to something, understand that there's a time limitation, and have the right workflow around those? So those are typically the challenges that we're seeing around policy management and some of the solutions that help solve those particular challenges. And looking at RSA's policy management solution, our solution enables you to centrally manage those policies that you have within the company, map them to the corporate objectives and the guidelines that have been defined, and then promote awareness to your user community, supporting and enhancing that culture of corporate governance. So we really focus heavily on organizing and giving you the ability to grow your governance program. How do we do this? We've talked a lot about solving some of the challenges, and our solution with policy management helps you solve those challenges. First and most importantly, centralizing that content. Bring it from all of its silos into a central repository, put it into a common form, allow you to relate things to each other where appropriate. And now that you've got it in a single place, you're now able to communicate those policies to the right users. So right off the bat, I can make sure that the right users are informed of the policies that are germane to their particular function and have some way to track, trace, and report on that activity. As you look back toward internal policy management, you can now demonstrate your governance. Since you understand all your policies, you understand how they relate to each other, you understand the standards by which you're bound, and the procedures by which to adhere to those standards, you can very quickly and easily demonstrate your governance against your policies, against the authoritative sources, and understand how it relates back to the corporate objectives that have been laid out. And then finally, as we talked about before, what happens in those cases where policy can't be followed for a momentary moment or in a particular use case? How do I manage those particular exceptions? How do I put the right kind of time limitations, workflows, and notifications around those exceptions so that not only can I potentially allow that exception for some period of time, maybe provide the right kind of workflow, approval process, and feedback to see if I need to go and adjust my policy to accommodate an exception that may be relevant. Why choose RSA Archer Policy Management? As a core EGRC, Enterprise Governance, Risk, and Compliance solution, we provide you with a rich out-of-the-box content library, including sample policies, many control standards, authoritative sources that are relevant in your various fields, control procedures on how to actually go implement the standards that exist or ask the right questions to understand how to implement those procedures, and then assessments. How do I ask the right kind of questions to determine whether or not I'm in compliance with this particular policy? Because we understand that you have tools, other data forms that might come in, we make sure that we are a data-driven approach to handle the policy structure, providing granular control over that policy content. So who has access to it, who can update, view, review, so that you have the right level of permission at the right place at the right time. And then finally, as we mentioned, not only operate under the normal circumstances, but make sure that we have the means to help you operate in the abnormal circumstances where you have exceptions, understand what they are, document them, relate them to risk, and then work through that particular workflow process. So what are some of the success stories that we see? And they map very closely back to the challenges that we mentioned very early in the presentation. Typically, a large company, in this case, we chose an airline reference, had an inability to keep up with new regulations and changes to existing regulations. How does that translate for us as we listen to the customer? That translated to some inefficient processes that developed over time. They didn't have the right kind of controls and test plans in place to relate one regulation to the other, and they weren't able to consistently go and track the metrics for how they were actually achieving and mapping to those policies. So after consultation, review of processes, discussion with the customer, and implementation of Archer Policy Management, you're able to consistently automate the process for managing life cycle of policies and the controls. So you gain that consistency, that regularity. You reduce time and effort to create, update, and communicate those policies. So those in charge of reviewing policy, uploading policy, and then disseminating that policy to the right community of users can work more effectively, and your employees or users are kept more up-to-date quicker with any policy changes. We provide that portal for visibility into the policies that we'll look at in the demo. Users now have regular and easy access to policies, to search, to review, to comment, and not having to go through and look at regular Word documents. You provide a much more eco-free and an easy way to look at your policies. And then finally, these guys were able to consolidate their control requirements for compliance processes. Because we're able to successfully map the authoritative sources, the policies, to that common standard, this customer found themselves in a position to collect information once and assess against it many times to understand where they were in the process, in their case, compliance process, and how to go about fixing those particular problems. So as we look at, and we'll talk about this as we go into the demo as well, for out-of-the-box content with authoritative sources, you'll find that we try to keep up with a wide variety of areas that are of interest, whether it's healthcare or ISO or NIST, if you're looking at some of the government space, or the items that have momentum within the community. For those items that we don't necessarily have out of the box, then we provide a robust system for having us as a vendor come in and help you import that particular policy, or you as a customer or your enabled partners to actually import proprietary policy, proprietary authoritative sources into the system, provide that mapping, and then leverage all the linkages that we have within the tool. So very often, if you have custom authoritative sources, which is typically what we see, that aren't necessarily in the public domain, maybe they're internal confidential documents, they would be imported and mapped to the authoritative sources application, which we'll see in the demo in a moment, that would then map to the control standards. So again, we're taking something that's industry-based, maybe something that's NIST-based or ISO-based, merging it with things that you may have that are very custom, but mapping them to a control standard. So we understand that ISO has something about password exceptions. Maybe you have an internal policy or authoritative source about password exceptions. We're going to map it to a common standard. That standard is then going to map to whatever your internal policy may be, which links to your corporate objective if you choose to define one or many. Because we have that common control standard, we can now send out those assessments with the right kind of questions from a procedure standpoint, or have an understanding of how we configure the particular tools that we have in our environment to go and enforce the standards for Windows versus Linux versus Solaris, for example. And then, of course, out of those standards, what are the exceptions? Why is there an exception? Which device, which user, which system, which network does that exception apply to? Who approved it? How long is that exception valid? So this particular slide gives you an indication of what our policy management solution structure is, how they link together, and hopefully gives you a good idea of where some of the custom pieces may come into play that will make this very local and very relevant if our out-of-the-box content doesn't match your needs. With that, we're going to go ahead and hop over to our live demo environment, where we're going to step through a couple of items about Archer policy management. And give me just a moment to switch over. So what you all should have on your screen now is the Archer web interface. So Archer is a web-based platform that's going to provide access to not only the admin users, but also any end users who may need to access the particular system. Just a few moments on orientation. My particular demo environment has all of our solutions enabled, but today we're just focusing on policy management, which is the tab we're on as you see across the top. I have the ability to navigate the various applications that are associated with this particular solution on the left-hand side, and we'll cover most of those today. And then I have the ability to present reports or searches in my dashboard, which is on the center of your screen right now. So in this particular case, we're starting out, and my default configuration is a policy management dashboard that gives me some overall visibility into where I am from a policy management standpoint. Where are my control standards as they relate to my authoritative sources? And this is just a glimpse of some of the top authoritative sources that we have mapped into our demo environment. From a workflow standpoint, as I look at some of the reporting ability, who owns particular policies? What state are they in? Who has a larger queue than someone else? Maybe I want to drill down into those and see who's working too hard or maybe who needs a little bit of help. And then as I relate to other components of Archer that allow me to give greater context, I can understand what parts of my business, in this case, have many exceptions. Maybe I'm uncomfortable with the North American IT shared services having so many exceptions. Maybe I want to review or provide some other context around that, so I could drill down into that particular report. That particular organization there, just as a side note, relates to Archer Enterprise Management, which helps me understand business hierarchy. So that's leveraging other solutions, maybe other folks who have authoritative sources of information about the infrastructure of the organization to enhance the reporting and slicing and dicing I might do in policy management. But what I first want to highlight, since we'll see a lot of the administrative components of this, is what might this look like for an end user who needs to come into the system. So I'm an employee, I'm a user, I'm a contractor. If you need to provide those particular users, that user community, with information on what your policies may be, this may be a dashboard that is relevant for those users. You have the ability to provide the right level of permissions and visibilities into the policies that exist, that particular user might be bound by, things they need to review, the standards and procedures that would be related to those, and any exceptions that are relevant to that particular user, the systems that particular user may have access to, or the business unit, for example, they're in control of. And then, of course, for those who are looking for information, maybe understand what they're doing but need to search through and look for something in particular, they can always go through and provide a search and search directly down into any of the relevant policy information, control standards, or procedures that would be relevant for the work that they're doing. In my case, I don't have any policy exception requests in this particular system, so the report window there shows no records. But as any systems that I'm in control of, any applications or devices that I've requested a policy exception for will show up in my reporting area, and I'll have the ability to track the status of those moment by moment and understand where my exceptions actually are. Since we're talking about exceptions, and it's the abnormal thing that may come across from time to time, exception requests can be tracked, reported on as well. And in this particular case, I'll go ahead and pick on Asia Pac Shared Services this go around. So I have an idea of what the exceptions are, what their status is, so that introduces the concept of workflow within an exception request, what control standard is impacted, and then some metrics around it, the date, when it might expire, and things like that. While today we're focusing heavily on just the policy management part of the exception process, as you begin to integrate other components of Archer, other solutions, you'll find that an exception request is highly related to compliance, is highly related to risk. So the fact that I'm accepting or requesting an exception may very well drive some other risk metrics, risk calculations, a notification and workflow in that particular work stream, or it may also drive some compliance calculations and dashboards as well. So the information that we're collecting here as it relates strictly to policy is definitely relevant and linked to other solutions within your GRC program, including risk and compliance. This particular default setup has a compliance impact rating, so that's one of the default items that's here. But obviously the metrics and the existence of this, its relationship to its enterprise asset, and any calculations of risk as it relates to that particular business unit, that individual, that system, that device, will reflect accordingly. But as we look at this particular exception request, notice the level of mapping that we're providing. We are maintaining the control standard that is impacted by this particular exception request. We understand what that control standard is, and we have a very clear indication of the exact policy definition that this maps back to. So we're leveraging that very powerful mapping to understand where this request applies and the ability to go right to that particular item. This may be a good time to go back and take a peek at the structure of policy management so we can get down to where that particular control standard comes into play. So we talked at a high level what's going to be internally available, and those are going to be some of the corporate objectives. So corporate objectives is an application for maintaining and managing any of those defined corporate objectives within the company. At a high level, they're providing the business requirements or the goals and objectives that you're trying to achieve. They can easily be defined, documented, and mapped to the policies that you have in place so that you have that very high-level view that allows you to then drill down into the other relevant areas of policy management. So in this case, let's take a peek at the policies that are defined within our environment here. And in this case, we have some sample policies that are included out of the box. And let's choose one that would probably be relevant and resonate with most users. And let's go ahead and choose access control. So as you notice, I have a very easy, very clear navigation path to understand what my policies are. what subsections exist, where they might exist, and what areas are relevant. And let's go ahead and take a look at authentication, and maybe we'll peek at something that's of interest, maybe password expiration or password strength or something of that nature. So as we look at these particular policy definitions, you see that I've got a very clear breakdown of where these are, the language that relates to them, and the ability to drill down into specific information about each of those. In this case, I'm looking at my access control, and I'm assessing some authentication items as they relate to authentication policy. So if I go down and I look, I've got various requirements here. Password strength requirement is usually one that's very straightforward to understand as well. And now I move from my policy definition to the standard that defines my password strength requirements. So in this particular case, again, we're looking at some of the rich out-of-the-box content that's provided by Archer around password strength requirements. In this case, we've got some text definition of that, relation back to compliance. So again, relating to other solutions that'll be very relevant for policy management. Who's responsible for this, when it's around, what type it is, when it's going to be reviewed again, so what its lifespan is. And then, very importantly, how does this map? We just came from policy to a control standard. Now, based on that PowerPoint slide we saw a few moments ago, what's the relationship between this particular standard and those authoritative sources that I'm bound to? So this now gives us an understanding that this particular password strength requirement control standard maps not only to 8.3.2 of my policy, but also maps to all of these authoritative sources that are in the Archer system. Obviously, you can add your own if you have custom authoritative sources, but from an industry standpoint, these are the authoritative sources that this particular standard maps to. So if I take a look, for example, at NIST 800-61, I see that this is the exact language that maps to that particular item. So I have a very clear understanding of where I am from a NIST standpoint based on and leveraging the mappings that we have to those particular control standards. As we go back to our control standard, we now have an understanding of the mappings to the technical control procedures that are related to that particular standard. So the standard's still giving me the high-level language. What's my password strength requirement? How do I technically go down and implement that on various systems and provide my user community, if it's a manual process, or my administrative community, if it's a manual process, or if I have tools that can actually go out and perform these particular tasks, how do I instruct those tools to do the right kinds of things? And that's where those control procedures come into play. Each of these control procedures, and I'll choose Windows Server 2008 in this case, will tell me how I go about configuring that particular system, Windows Server 2008, to adhere to that particular standard around password strength. So you have the ability to go in and actually tell those tools or instruct the individuals on how you go about doing that. And as you see with the tabs that I'm clicking through, we provide you with the right kind of buckets, the right areas to consume the results of implementing this particular control procedure, whether it's an automatic testing result, whether it's a manual testing result, and then what are the findings. So we're really providing you a robust capability to have standardization, test against it, get the right kind of feedback, and then relate it to other areas of the business where relevant, whether it's risk and figuring out how you might accept that particular risk as a result, or any other policy you may have. While we're in this particular control procedure, I want to highlight something that's very relevant for a lot of customers, and that is Archer provides a great deal of out-of-the-box content. We provide some of our wording that we've inherited over the years, modified over the years based on customer feedback. But maybe it just doesn't sound like the language that your company uses for password strength, password length. So Archer provides you the reference content, the information that we would provide you out of the box. But as a customer, you can go and change the language that is facing your users. So you can still leverage, maintain the mapping, keep the original language that we provided as a vendor, but then change the language so that the description, the wording used, the vernacular of your company is represented in this particular control procedure, the control standard, or any other component where we need to change the language to sound more local. So know that you have that flexibility and capability within the system as well. So as we begin to go back, we're back up to our particular control standard in this case, leveraging those mappings. We talked about technical control procedures where there are tools or it's technology-oriented. But what happens if I have to do a manual assessment? What happens if the system is disconnected, I don't have a tool that can go in and assess this particular standard? Archer provides a rich content of questions out of the box that allow you to go and build a questionnaire so that I can ask you a series of questions, the right kind of questions, and your responses to those particular questions immediately help me understand how you're meeting this particular standard. So in this case, we're looking at a question library. This is just showing 5 of the questions that are relevant for our password strength requirement control standard. But by building an assessment, by building a questionnaire and sending it out with one or more of these particular questions, the answers that the user provides is going to help me understand how are they meeting this particular standard. Because those answers have correct and incorrect answers, I can immediately turn around and generate findings if I get the incorrect answer. I know it's a binary. I know it has a particular answer range that should be correct. If I don't get the right answer, I know that I am no longer in compliance with this particular standard, and I can kick off the right kind of workflow by generating a finding, notifying the right users, having the right kind of interaction with that particular system as a result of that answer. And then back to what we talked about before, working outside the norms. What are the exception requests that are related to this particular standard? So as I look to slice and dice, report on particular items, how do I understand where my exceptions lie? In this case, I have no fewer than 5 exceptions related to this particular control standard. So this may drive just an understanding as to where your exceptions are, maybe what part of the business is requesting the most exceptions. But at the same time, this may very well trigger review of this particular standard to see if it needs modification. And again, demonstrating workflow at each of the varying levels, I can have various levels of review and approvals as part of this particular exception. In this case, I just have a reviewer and a management review before this particular item is accepted or goes into effect or moves to the next level. And then I also have a concept of attaching items, but also requesting an extension. So we have exceptions to the exception. So as we move back up, you've noticed we have very easily and successfully navigated an entire policy management solution, from the corporate objectives that come down to policies that have been defined, how those policies relate to control standards, standards which relate to your authoritative sources, the outside sources, the other documents within your company that actually require you to be bound by, and then how I might go about implementing those in an automated way or a manual way via questions and questionnaires. And then how do I handle the exceptions to the rules? Those are dumped into that issues management solution where what are the exceptions? How do I manage those? What's the workflow around them? And then as we relate this to other solutions, how do I go about understanding what's the risk relationship? What's the compliance relationship? How we've organized this particular solution begins to tie deeply into risk management and compliance management to help you answer some of those questions. So as we've gone through our policy management solution, what we've tried to do is define your governance program, give you a good foundation for your governance program. Many organizations, how do you think about how do you measure this? How do you manage your risk? How do you manage your compliance? How do you perform an audit? Those are the linkages you now begin to see with other relevant solutions within the Archer platform. Our out-of-the-box content provides you a rich starting point. So understand that whether you have your own policy, whether you're looking for some guidance on how you might define a policy and relate it back to items, you have a very rich starting point by which to go about building that policy. You've got over 10,000 questions to ask to make sure that you're adhering to standards related back to those policies and authoritative sources. And then finally, you've got the right mechanisms to deliver that information to the right users, permission it to the right individuals, provide the right visibility back into the system, but also the ability to go back and actually provide users access to the information that they're bound to. A complete policy management solution available from Archer. So I see there were a couple questions. Hopefully I was able to cover them as we went through. Just go back and explicitly answer. Questions asking, will an end user be able to search within the contents of documents? Yes. As long as that document is in a text parsable way, so it's a Word document, if it's a PDF, yes, that user will be able to go back and search that particular document once it's been uploaded. The exception there is, of course, if your PDF is a series of screenshots, then that's obviously not something that can be parsed in an OCR type way and searched. But PDFs that are standard Word documents, things like that, are absolutely able to be searched once they're uploaded into the system for those particular users. I think the other question was looking at how you relate some of the exception requests to risk. I think I touched on that as we went through. While this particular webcast is highly focused on policy management, I think you can see where some of these solutions are beginning to link into the other relevant components that exist, including but not limited to compliance and risk. So yes, absolutely. For an exception, if there is another risk process around it, whether you accept it, whether you've got to mitigate it, or any other option, that is absolutely a workflow offshoot that can be driven off of the exception requests. So that's what I had for you today for Archer Policy Management. See a couple new questions coming in, so we definitely got time. One of the questions is, what are our options to import our current policy documents into Archer? Which is a very good question. When you look at any of the structure of a tool or any of the documents that are within Archer, you notice that at the end of the day, it is text. So Archer provides, and this to the point of this particular question, a data import feature. And at the end of the day, you are properly formatting the policies that you have. So we're going to make sure your policy is broken down into the appropriate sections. And we are effectively going to go and parse them into the particular areas here. So if you have an 18.0 that's something new, we'll simply go through, provide the text document to do an import, import them into the right kind of tree, the right area, make sure our numbering lines up correctly, and we'll take your text document, import it into the tool from that Word or Excel document, and then give you the ability to then turn around and begin to map that new policy to some standards. As you become a more advanced user, you'll be in a position to go and have as part of that import some of the mapping processes done so that as soon as you import, it's already mapped. But as you begin, you may find that you're going through and mapping a particular standard to that new policy that you just entered in. Just reading some of the other questions here. Give me a moment. So we've got another question around policy mapping, and I think that might be most relevant if we hop back to the PowerPoint presentation for just a moment. So let me see if I can find. I think this is the most relevant slide that'll help with this particular question. So the question at a high level there is if you import your own policy and you map it to, the question was a particular PCI in this case. Let me go ahead and change your question just a little bit to what I think you may have been asking, and then you can provide me some feedback there as well. So if you know that you have a policy that is related to a particular authoritative source, whether it's something related to PCI or something of that level, then you're going to be looking for the standards that are actually related to that particular authoritative source. And because you map your policy to the right standard that maps to, in your case, maybe a specific authoritative source, that standard is also going to be mapped to other authoritative sources. So while you may have your blinders on that I've got to be PCI compliant, I've got a policy that's related only to that, and I map to those particular standards, the standards that are related to PCI may very well be related to ISO or NIST. So that's where the power of this particular mapping comes into play around control standards. Just because PCI has some language around password expiration doesn't mean that some other folks don't have similar items and will leverage that same mapping so that a single mapping to password expiration as a control standard maps to potentially 15 authoritative sources. So hopefully that answers your question around that particular item, around mapping a policy to a particular standard that then would be related to one or more authoritative sources. A couple other questions here as I scroll through. Okay, so one of the other questions here has to do with ISMS. So effectively, at the end of the day, generically speaking, to cover a couple of other areas where that may very well be relevant, does Archer help accommodate a process, whether that's a policy process, a business process, or any other standard process? And the answer is yes in this case. A lot of the things we talked about today around policy management have to do with I physically have to go do something. I've got to touch a system. I've got to configure a system. I've got to ask some questions and levy something against a particular system. But hopefully you saw within some of those applications the workflow that would effectively accommodate any other process that might just be completely people-oriented as well. So if I have to have a particular review requirement, if I have to have some level of feedback around SLAs or maybe some other kind of performance indicators that are more business-driven, not necessarily IT or technical-driven, Archer provides you the ability to go and build a process around that, leverage the same kind of mapping, same kind of tools to get the right kind of feedback in whatever form that might be. So hopefully that got to that particular question. I saw one or two kind of like that, so I tried to combine them into one. But hopefully that answered that particular question as well.